I kept a promise for 50 years. Funny way to keep a promise, though. The strange part is that I kept it by never actually carrying it out. I know how that sounds. It sounds like the kind of sentence a man says when he's trying to explain something that stopped making sense a long time ago, but it's the truth. There's a letter in my wallet right now, and it has been there longer than most things in my life. Longer than my first marriage, longer than the house where I raised my son, longer than most of the friends I used to meet on quiet Friday nights. 50 years is a long time for a piece of paper to survive, especially when it's been folded and carried around through half a lifetime. But this one did. When I hold it now, it doesn't feel like paper anymore. It feels softer somehow, almost like cloth, the way old flags begin to feel after they've been folded and unfolded for decades. I never opened it, not once. The letter wasn't written to me, and the man who wrote it has been dead for half a century. We called him Kid. Truth is, most of us out there were kids, but some of them looked younger than the rest. Kid had that kind of face, clean skin, bright eyes, the kind of kid you expect to see pumping gas somewhere back home, or helping customers carry groceries to their cars. Not the kind of face you expect to see moving slowly through wet jungle with a rifle in his hands. I remember the night he gave me the letter. We were sitting on our packs waiting for the moon to climb high enough so we could move again. The jungle was quiet, and out there quiet can mean two very different things. Sometimes it means the jungle is resting, other times it means the jungle is listening. Kid was hunched over a little notebook, writing under the dim glow of a red flashlight like every word required careful thought. After a while, I asked him what he was working so hard on. He said he was writing his mom. Simple as that. But he kept stopping between sentences, staring at the page like he was trying to get something exactly right. You know the way people write when they're trying to say something that matters. Eventually, he folded the paper slowly, pressed the crease down with his thumb, and looked over at me. "If something happens to me," he said, "would you send this to my mum?" He didn't say it dramatically. He didn't say it like a man expecting to die. He said it the way someone asks you to water their plants while they're out of town, just a practical favor between two men sitting in the dark. I told him nothing was going to happen to him. That's what you say in a place like that. You don't challenge the future when you're out in the bush. You just pretend everything will keep working the way it's supposed to. Kid nodded like he understood the ritual of the answer. Then he slipped the letter into my hand and said again, "Just in case." I folded the envelope once and slid it into the breast pocket of my jacket. At the time, it didn't feel like anything important, just paper. Just another small promise made in the middle of a long night, in a place where promises were easy to make because the future always felt far away. Kid died 3 days later. Not in some heroic charge, and not in one of those moments that people later describe with dramatic music and slow motion. Just one of those sudden turns the bush could take. One minute everything was quiet, the kind of quiet that almost convinces you the world is behaving itself, and the next minute it wasn't. That's all it took. That was the moment the letter changed. Up until then, it was just a folded piece of paper sitting in my pocket. After that, it became something heavier than the rest of the gear I carried. Not physically heavier, of course, but the kind of weight that follows a man around without ever making a sound. At first, I told myself I would send it when we rotated out. That seemed reasonable enough. When you're still living in the bush, your mind isn't built to think too far ahead. The future is a foggy place out there. All you really focus on is getting through the next patrol, the next night, the next morning when the sun rises, and you realize you're still here. So the letter stayed in my pocket while the weeks passed. Then the months passed. Eventually, our tour ended, and we rotated home, back in the world. That's what we called it back then, back in the world. Streets without mud, nights without insects screaming in the dark, people arguing about baseball scores, and gas prices like those were the biggest problems a person could have. I remember unpacking my gear in a small apartment the day I noticed the letter again. It slipped out of the pocket of my jacket and landed on the floor beside my boots. I picked it up and looked at the handwriting on the front. A mother's name, an address somewhere in Ohio. That was the first time it really occurred to me what mailing that letter would actually mean. Sending it wouldn't just deliver words. It would deliver the news that a son wasn't coming home. Out in the bush, death belonged to us. We carried it, we buried it, and we kept walking. But back in the world, death belonged to families, to kitchen tables and quiet phone calls in the afternoon. I told myself I'd send the letter the next day. Tomorrow always feels like a safe place to leave difficult things. But tomorrow came and went, and life started filling up the empty spaces. Work, rent, groceries, the slow process of learning how to sleep through a night without listening for sounds that weren't there anymore. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. Every once in a while, I would feel the corner of that envelope in my wallet when I reached for cash. It was like a quiet tap on the shoulder, a reminder that something unfinished was still traveling through my life with me. America changed during those years. Different presidents came and went. Different wars showed up on the evening news. Even the music on the radio began to sound different from the songs I remembered hearing before I left. But that letter never changed. It stayed folded exactly the same way, sealed the same way, waiting in the dark corner of my wallet. I carried it through every version of my life. Through the day I got married, through the first small house we bought, through the nights my son was born. Every time I bought a new wallet, the letter moved into it like an old tenant following me from place to place. Sometimes, when I was cleaning things out, I would take it out and look at it for a moment. The handwriting never changed. The envelope stayed sealed. I used to tell myself I hadn't mailed it because a letter seemed too small for something like that. Maybe a mother deserved more than a piece of paper arriving in the mailbox. Maybe she deserved someone to sit down across from her and explain who her son had been during those last days. Maybe she deserved to hear the story in a human voice instead of reading it alone at the kitchen table. At the time, that sounded honorable, almost thoughtful. But somewhere along the way, I started suspecting the truth might be simpler than that. I was afraid of the moment when the letter would leave my hands. Because once something like that is delivered, the story ends. The waiting ends. Whatever fragile version of hope a person might still be carrying around quietly inside their chest disappears. For a long time, the mother remained just an address on an envelope. I didn't imagine it very clearly, but time has a strange way of changing the shape of guilt. After about 20 years, a thought began creeping into my mind that hadn't been there before. What if she had spent all those years waiting, not knowing what had really happened, just living inside that long, quiet space between uncertainty and acceptance? Parents don't stop waiting easily. Once that thought took hold, it never really left me alone. I began imagining her life in small pieces. A modest house somewhere in Ohio, a kitchen window looking out at a quiet street. Maybe every afternoon she walked down to check the mailbox, at first expecting news, later hoping for it, and eventually perhaps fearing it. Meanwhile, the letter stayed in my wallet, folded and silent like it had been from the very beginning. Life kept moving forward. My son grew up. For a while, he even joined the army himself, though his war took place in a desert instead of a jungle. The day he shipped out, I almost told him about the letter. I almost said there are promises a man carries longer than he ever expected. But some stories are difficult to explain without sounding like something you're not proud of. Around that time, I finally did something I probably should have done decades earlier. I looked up the address on the envelope. The house was still there. Small town, 3 states away. One autumn afternoon, I got into my car and started driving. The sky was grey that day, the kind of low, cloudy sky that makes everything feel a little older than it really is. When I reached the town, the streets were quiet. The house was smaller than I imagined, white siding, a narrow porch, a maple tree in the front yard. I parked across the street and sat there for a long time. The letter was in my jacket pocket, and I could feel it through the fabric just the way I had felt it years earlier in the bush. Eventually, I stepped out of the car and walked across the street. Each step up the path felt heavier than the one before it. I kept trying to think of the right words. How do you begin a conversation that is 50 years late? By the time I reached the porch, my hands were shaking. The door stood right in front of me, paint worn thin around the handle. I could hear a television somewhere inside the house, laughter from some daytime program drifting faintly through the walls. Just ordinary life continuing on a quiet afternoon. All I had to do was knock. 3 small taps and the promise would finally be finished. But another thought arrived before my hand reached the door. What if she had already built a version of the story she could live with? Maybe she believed her son had died quickly. Maybe she believed he wasn't afraid. Maybe she believed his last thoughts were of home. Sometimes those kinds of stories are the only things that help people survive the years that follow loss. Suddenly, the letter in my pocket felt dangerous. I didn't know what kid had written inside it. I never opened it. It might contain comfort, but it might also contain fear or regret or honesty that a mother was never meant to carry for the rest of her life. I stood there on that porch for a long time, while the wind pushed dry leaves across the boards. The television inside the house continued playing to an audience that had no idea a stranger was standing outside the door, holding half a century of silence in his pocket. And then I did something I still think about from time to time. I turned around, I walked back down the path, got into my car, and drove away without knocking. On the drive home, I told myself something that sounded almost wise. I told myself that maybe silence can sometimes be a form of mercy. Maybe not every truth needs to arrive at someone's doorstep. But the older I get, the less certain that explanation feels. Because the truth is, I still don't know if the woman who lived in that house is alive today, or if she passed away years ago. Either way, the letter is still here with me. Sometimes, late at night, I take it out and hold it in my hand. The paper feels fragile now, like it might fall apart if I tried to unfold it. I imagine the words inside, the kind of things young men write when they're trying to be brave for someone they love. Maybe he told his mother he loved her. Maybe he apologized for something small that felt big at the time. Maybe he told her not to worry. Young men write things like that before they learn how complicated life becomes. I often wonder what kid would think if he knew what happened to his letter. If he knew it traveled quietly through 50 years of ordinary American life through jobs, birthdays, arguments, quiet mornings with coffee and newspapers, never delivered, never opened, just carried. I would like to believe he would understand, but I'm not certain that he would. Promises are strange things. We make them believing the future will give us time to keep them. But most of the time they end up living quietly in the past instead. I am an old man now, and this letter is still folded in the same place it has always been. The address is faded but still readable, a mother's name written by a young soldier who never came home. And sometimes, When the house is quiet late at night, I find myself wondering something I still don't have an answer for. If a promise is made to the dead, and the living keep it only through silence, did they really keep the promise at all?